Joining us now with a view from the other side, we turn to the man who was in charge of getting Barack Obama elected president, his 2008 campaign manager and author of the newly updated paperback version of his book, The Audacity to Win, How Obama Won and How We Can Beat the Party of Limbaugh, Beck, and Palin. David Plouffe, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Good to be with you, David.
A lot to get to. I want to start on the economy and domestic affairs, and we'll touch on the wars as I did with Senator Graham in just a minute. I want to start with the reality, and that is that this president and his party are running on an economic record. And here is that record in a nutshell, and it's not a good one. 9.6% unemployment rate, 14.9 million unemployed, 6.2 million of which are long-term unemployed beyond 27 weeks, an estimated 3 million property foreclosures this year. We cannot forget the depth of the housing crisis. After 19 months in office, President Obama is accountable for this record, is he not?
Sure he is. We're less than 60 days out from an election, and elections are about choices. So let's remember where we were. The Republican Party that wants to gain back control, their policies contributed to the worst economic crisis this country's seen since the Great Depression. If they had their way, we might have headed to a depression, opposing the Recovery Act. So no one's satisfied with where we are. The question is, are we making progress? We had 22 straight months in this country of private sector job loss. We've had 8 straight months of private sector job gain. Not as high as anyone would like, but we're on the right path here. And so the question for the American people is, the Republican experiment's a very recent one. Fiscal irresponsibility, really an unprecedented assault on the middle class and small businesses, the same exact policies. And by the way, the guy who's in charge of the Republican campaign committee was on your show about 6 weeks ago and said if they won back the majority, what they were going to pursue is the same policies they had done previously, which led to this economic calamity.
But isn't it striking after 19 months, rather than being able to run on a record when this president has had some big swings legislatively at the economy, that you are left basically saying, well, you know, we may not have done the job, but the other guys are really worse.
Well, no one's saying we're not doing the job. We're very proud of what we've done, which is this hole was so deep. It's going to, as the president said at his inaugural address, it's going to take some time to dig out. But we're on the right path here. Economic policies aimed squarely at the middle class and small businesses, creating a new energy sector, the health care law, which over time I think is going to play a big impact in economic growth. So, no, we're proud to talk about what we've done.
But 82% of Americans polled believe that the country's still in recession.
Well, people are struggling. No one's suggesting otherwise. But the question
so they don't believe what you say, which is that we're on the right path.
Well, when people are struggling, they don't have a job, their family member doesn't have a job, they haven't got a raise, they're right to be frustrated. The question we have to put in front of people in these next 2 months is, this is a choice. And the Republican ideas were soundly rejected at the ballot box the last 2 years. More importantly, were soundly rejected by the American people. They're offering nothing new, the same old policies that led this country this close. Senator Graham was talking about, you know, the right ditch, the left ditch. They drove us into the ditch. And if we give the keys back to the people who did this, it'd be like giving Herbert Hoover the keys in the mid-1930s.
The summation, Time Magazine has a summation of sort of the depth of the political peril for the president and the Democrats. I'll put it up on the screen. With midterm elections just 9 weeks off, instead of generational transformation, some Democrats predicted after '08, the president's party teeters on the brink of a broad setback in November, including the possible loss of both houses of Congress by a 10-point margin. People say they will vote for Republicans over Democrats in Congress, the largest such gap ever recorded by Gallup. How did it get so bad?
Well, first of all, when you have a tough economy and you're in power, you're going to have a tough political environment. Secondly, we won so many elections in 2006 and 2008. Even in a neutral electoral environment, it was clear we were going to give some of that back. So over the next 2 months, what we really have to do is 2 things. One, Republicans are very enthusiastic about voting. We have to get more Democrats enthused about voting. I think laying out the stakes for this election, the real choice, that they're not just going to bring bad ideas, they're going to try and roll back all that the president and his party has accomplished. And secondly, for those undecided voters out there, make them understand this is not the new Republican Party. It's the same old ideas, the same old adherence to the special interest. Speaker Boehner was talking about all the reforms he's going to bring. I mean, give me a break. This is the party that tried to change the rules to allow their majority leader to still serve if he was indicted. John Boehner, who would be the Speaker of the House years ago, was handing out checks from tobacco companies on the House floor and is now up on Wall Street saying, give us money because we're protecting you by opposing things like financial reform. So the movie was a nightmare for America. It's a recent experiment, and we have to make sure everybody out there who's undecided, and just as importantly, those Democrats who aren't any threat to vote for a Republican but are saying, I'm not sure if I'm going to vote, we have to go talk to them and make sure they understand the stakes here.
One of the things you said back in January of 2009 is that bipartisanship was so important, and this is what you told the Washington Post at the time. One thing I'm sure of, there's not going to be a Democratic solution to the economy or a Democratic health care plan or a Democratic energy plan. It's got to be an American plan and effort, and if that happens, I think we can make progress. The reality is they have all been Democratic plans. You have not had bipartisanship. You have lost tremendous ground with 60% disapproval among independent voters. Isn't that the problem you warned of?
Well, first on bipartisanship, actually, we did get some Republican support for things like the Recovery Act for financial reform on health care. It's right. But the votes might have been all Democratic. But the truth is there were so many Republican ideas in there. And this is another argument for the election. The Republicans' opposition to what the president and a lot of our party has tried to do is less grounded in principle than it is in politics. This country's got deep challenges, but opportunities too. And rather than participate in trying to move this country forward, the Republicans, in a very craven, crass way, are playing short-term politics. And listen, we're going to have a tough election this November. I think it can be better than people think. But I think the long-term damage the Republican Party is doing to itself is profound.
Well, and I want to get to the Republicans in just a minute, but let me pin you down on that point. Is Democratic control of the House and the Senate in jeopardy?
What I would say is I think right now, because this is going to be elections between two people in a state, in some cases it'll be three people where there's Tea Party, third party candidates, but in states and districts. And I think if you look at that, the Senate, they'd have to run the table. I don't see any evidence of that, and we've got people running strong campaigns. We've won a lot of special elections in the House because our House candidates are running great localized campaigns, really focusing on turnout and making that a choice between two individuals. So now this is a turbulent political environment. We have big majorities, so of course we're going to give some of that back. But I think we can maintain control in both chambers if we make this a choice between two people in districts and states, and we have to make sure Democratic turnout jumps up. Because right now the Republicans are coming out at a very high level. We shouldn't expect that to abate.
But isn't part of what you're getting at here is that you have to basically shift the mindset of voters to the shortcomings of their opponents? Because if it is a referendum on the president and his leadership, you come up short.
Well, listen, elections are choices. So we're happy to talk about, the Recovery Act and what it meant, the jobs and businesses that have sprouted up all over America, the new energy economy, combat our operations in Iraq coming to a close, all the health care assist that seniors are going to get.
But I'm asking about the president's leadership, whether that's being graded here, whether it's being tested here.
I think the way voters look at this election is I've got two people running for the Senate or for the House. And they're going to evaluate the positions and views of both of those people. But listen, I think we as Democrats, we do have to make this a choice. And so the Republicans need to be on trial here too. But we ought to be proud of what we've done. Because this is leadership. These were not normal times. We were facing unprecedented economic crisis and issues like health care, energy, education that leadership in this town had refused to deal with for decades.
But look, the Democrats are in power. One of the things that got you to the White House was the strength of independent support. Independent voters, as I said, are now disapproving of the president's performance at a 60% margin. You have made the point that everybody out there in America is making adjustments in their lives. Washington doesn't seem to be making any adjustments in the way they're spending money or running the government. That has to lay at the doorpost of the doormat of the president and the Democrats.
Well, first of all, I do think most voters out there think, when asked who's really trying to reach out to the other side, who's trying to bring more of a spirit of debate and bipartisanship to Washington, believe the president's trying to. Secondly, on spending, the president's done some tough things on spending. First of all, being honest about the spending, for the first time in a long time. The Republicans, obviously, are lecturing us about fiscal discipline. It was their policies and their fiscal positions that led us to this position. So first of all, we should not take any lections from them. And on tax cuts, which Senator Graham just talked about, they want to extend them for another 10 years, which is $700 billion without paying for them. So we have to remind people, when President Clinton left office, we had a surplus. We had a record deficit over $1.3 trillion when President Obama took office. Why? Because the Republicans had unpaid for wars, tax cuts, entitlement expansion. Do you really believe 3 years later you can trust them on fiscal matters?
Well, but let's talk about tax cuts for a second, because Mark Zandi, who is an economist who has advised Republicans and Democrats, wrote this in the New York Times about the tax cuts we can afford. The prudent middle ground, he wrote, would be to forestall any tax increases in 2011 and to phase in higher rates on upper-income households in 2012 when the economy will be on firmer ground. In other words, don't raise any taxes right now extend all the Bush-era tax cuts. Why isn't that a good idea? There are a lot of Democrats, by the way, lining up behind that very position.
First thing I'd say, what the congressional Republicans are proposing is a permanent extension of tax cuts for the wealthiest, which means 80% of the people that get those tax cuts are millionaires, okay? Permanent. Now, in a recession, I understand those who say maybe for a year we should consider this. My view would be, and I'm not an economist, and I'm certainly not involved in these decisions.
What's the president's view?
But here's that if we're going to borrow money from the Chinese to give further tax cuts, it ought not go to millionaires. We ought to do more for small businesses and tax cuts. So what the president is proposing is permanent extension of tax cuts for the middle class. We have a small business plan right now in front of the United States Senate that would provide huge tax relief, incentive for lending, incentive for expansion. That's what we ought to be doing.
Will the president entertain the idea of extending all the tax cuts for a period of 2 years?
I don't know what his final position is going to be. What he's been pretty clear on this, which is the middle class and small businesses ought to be the target of our tax relief, that those at the very top, and again, we're not talking about the mom and pop small business person. We're talking about 80% of the people the Republicans want to give permanent tax credits to are millionaires without paying for it. So this is a very important issue. I think we won the tax debate with John McCain in 2008 because the American people believed that we wanted to cut taxes for them, not the big corporate interests and not millionaires in this country.
I'm curious, when we talk about economic recovery and the political scene, former President Clinton has been campaigning. The New York Times covered one of his statements when he was on the trail, and I'll put it up on the screen. He said, "A year and a half just wasn't enough time to get us out of the hole we are in, so I want you to stick with us. Give us 2 more years until another election. If we fail, you can throw us all out." Does President Obama see it that way? In other words, he's got 1 term to turn this thing around?
He doesn't view it through the prism of politics. He views it through the prism of the country was in an enormous hole, so we had to do everything we can to dig out of that. Plus, we had ignored the long-term challenges of health care, energy, economy, education reform, and that's how he views it. And if you make decisions based on politics, you're going to do the country a big disservice.
But with what maybe President Clinton was referring to, do you envision a primary challenge from another Democrat in 2012 against this president?
Oh, I can't imagine that. And, we've got 1 election in front of us. It seemed like the last one just ended.
Right.
So there'll be time to talk about 2012.
But given who made that statement, can you rule out, based on actual information, that Secretary of State Clinton would not pursue the presidency again, would not challenge President Obama?
Listen, you saw this week. They're working so well together, working on Middle East peace, and it's a wonderful partnership. And, I think that was a really inspired choice by the president, and Secretary of State Clinton is just doing a remarkable job. So
is that a yes, no, or maybe?
Listen, they're a team, and a great team for America.